Well, thanks for stopping by. Today's show is a great debate. Be it resolved that developer employability hinges on their security skills. Welcome to Threat Actions This Week, the show where we look at the latest threats, tech, and actions your organization can take. Today's top security talent share their insights with you. I'm joined by four individuals who are going to help set us straight on the security skills of developers. First, out of the San Diego area, Shannon Leitz. She leads DevSecOps at Intuit. She also is a founder of DevSecOps.org. She is a returning guest to the show. Shannon, thanks for making the time.
Thank you for having me here. Super excited.
Thank you. And Amir Sharif, he is the founder of Apparetto. They're doing some really cool things in securing containers, microservices, and the cloud. He's joining out of San Jose. Glad you could make it, Amir.
Thank you, David. It's a lot of fun.
And we've got Brian Kelly. He is the head of Conjur Engineering. Conjur, of course, is now a part of CyberArk. He's joining out of the Boston area. Thanks for making the time as well, Brian.
You're welcome. Thanks, David, for having me on.
And Kyle Bissett. He's joining from Arctic, not the Arctic, but Antarctic, which is the company, which is spelled with a Q, so ARCTIQ.ca. Kyle is in the Prince Edward Island area today. Normally, you can find him in Toronto, Canada, or somewhere across the country. Kyle, as well, thanks for making the time today.
Yeah, it's nice to be here, especially from Prince Edward Island.
Now, let's get into the core reason why we're here today, which is the great DevSec debate. Be it resolved that developer employability will hinge on their security skills. On the pro side is going to be Shannon and Amir, who are going to be arguing that, yes, developer employability will hinge on their security skills. And on the con side, saying, nah, maybe, but maybe there's other mitigating factors, is going to be Kyle and Brian. Now, let's face it. This is a very nuanced kind of debate, and we can all argue all sides of this. We're going to think about the context within which they're working, right? So how old of a developer are you? Are you just starting out in your career? Are you mid-career? Are you late career? Kind of what type of development are you doing? Is it back-end development? Is it out in the cloud? Is it for microservices? Organization dynamics. There's going to be all kinds of things that'll factor into what the shape of a career curve will look like. And we think, Brian, about their ability to get jobs over the next few years.
I think if we don't improve how we do things and we continue to basically suck at security as a profession, then yes, that will be the outcome. But I don't want that to be the outcome. So I'm very opinionated about this, as you can probably guess already. We are embarrassing ourselves as a profession in terms of breaches, extent of attacks, just the amount of vulnerable software that's out there. It's ridiculous. It's like the railroad boom. Imagine if that had happened, but every 79th piece of track that was laid down was just missing. That's kind of how I see professional cloud native software development in terms of security. It is a horrible, horrible state of affairs. I think we probably all agree on the problem, but the solution is probably where we disagree. I don't think developers need to become more and more security experts to solve that. I would like that to be the case, but we're already asking developers in a microservices-based world to become extremely good application programmers, learn about mobile development, internationalization, UX, distributed systems, protocols, Paxos, eventual consistency, Capterium, whatever, and deal with all this other stuff. And by the way, you got to keep everything secure too. We're asking too much of developers. Cognitively, it's just too much to hold in a human brain and be successful at it. And I don't see schools or colleges churning out any kind of fundamental security training for CS graduates. Maybe there's some schools doing it a little bit, but people are leaving, with their CS degrees, unaware of OWASP, unaware of how to defend against the most common attacks. So, given those factors, I think we should do our best as an industry to provide tools that abstract away the things that will make applications vulnerable. Because we don't let developers write databases anymore because it's kind of assumed that there are database experts and it's a niche and those people will write great databases for us that we can then use. Same thing for compilers, operating systems, data centers. We've at least adopted one thing into our industry, which is, never write your own cryptography protocol, which is great. No one's going to go re-implement TLS or SSL. Wonderful. Now let's extend that. Let's have basic application security be refactored out of the developer's day-to-day and put into the platform. And some things are doing it, like Lambda's great example. A lot of stuff you just can't do with good reason, and you will have a more secure app if we can improve that model of just taking things away and stopping developers having to even worry about this in the first place.
Wow, Shannon, Brian came out with some powerful points. What do you think about this?
Yes, the old school position on security. Yes, yeah, the dinosaurs called and they're already oil. They want you back. So from the perspective of adding security to your workloads, there's no one better than a developer to understand the decisions they've made about balancing risk versus development, as well as, how they're going to generate potentially revenue if they're a revenue generating app that's being built. As you kind of look at front end, back end development, all of that, describing a monolith to justify old school security positions, not necessarily the way to win this argument. The cloud is bringing more of things like microservices. We're seeing containers take place. Security is becoming more built in, but it's because everyone's starting to play their part. They're making security decisions about how their application might be used by a bad guy. Things like understanding the ideal victim for your application is something that's critical to be built into that workload. And essentially what we're going to see is less and less the monolith, but more and more the microservice, where developers are being asked to not necessarily have to learn everything, but they have to be able to understand the facets of their application. And who better to add security to their mindset, their skills, and their capabilities than the developer that's working on a microservice that loves that microservice the most and understands every facet of it at the core level. From my perspective, what I've seen is the cloud is bringing more and more security because we're finding ways to collaborate at a greater level through the advent of integration, and solely, saying that somebody can't do this is, I think, a miss. I think the tipping point really has come with the cloud adoption, and I'm super excited to see it.
Kyle, are you Kylesaurus Rex, or what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think with this conversation, we'll all end in one place, and we'll all agree that we need a little bit of everything to be successful here. I don't think there's one silver bullet. One conversation I always find interesting is even when I meet someone and I ask them what their career is, and if no one really answers, I'm a developer anymore. What does that mean? There's days when I feel like a developer. I'm building, infrastructure automation some days. Is that considered development? I think so. And if I leave holes in my platform and allow people to run containers as root and things like that, and the developer is using base Docker file or some kind of system I set up, well, I've introduced the vulnerability and the developer is not really aware of that potentially. So I think it comes down to both. If we can educate people on security, that's great, but it actually takes a focus. We need our customers to start to invest and re-augment their training plans and start to enable their team. Let's be honest, not everyone's willing to go spend their evenings watching videos and reading blogs and testing things out. So they're going to have to learn by doing. And there's a large crop of developers. I don't think the market is struggling anyway for people to get jobs. So back to the question of, is it going to hinder their job seeking? I think there's going to be lots of work out there. It'll probably be the quality and what positions they're playing and what decisions that will judge, how well at security they are and how much they can jump into a team. So I think it's both. I think we can't expect every developer to be a security expert, so we better give them a platform and automation to be able to, know when they made a mistake. Someone obviously still needs to build the policies and the governance models and the tooling behind the scenes. I think a lot of it comes down to the concept of building pipelines. Start small, get your code being built, but then start to introduce security checks and things like that. We've got some people doing some really innovative things out there to catch things that we're downloading. I mean, let's be honest, all the developers are downloading their code from the internet. They're doing Git pulls. They don't really know what's inside of it. And I don't think we can expect them to read every single line of code that they're downloading from a library. So we need tooling, we need education. I think we need a little bit of everything, but I don't think it's going to hinder the job perspective so much, but certainly the quality and what kind of work you're doing will be, you'll be better off if you have a good, strong security practice behind yourself.
So Amir, Kyle's making some interesting points around the amount of time that developers may need to peel away from some of the other things they do, or they've got to burn the midnight oil, as it were. What do you think? Can developers do this? Should developers do this? Is their employability going to hinge on their security skills that they've got?
I have to agree with Kyle that basically there are going to be enough jobs that developers will get their jobs, regardless of how sloppy they are with security. But that's a secondary question. I mean, there is almost an ethical obligation that we should have on making our workloads and the data of our customers secure. And Brian made a point of, look, the developers don't write their own databases anymore. That's true, but they are responsible for writing good data schemes in a way that the database can work properly. Likewise, there's lots of open source code out there, as Kyle put out, but we should not put our passwords in plain text in a public GitHub repo. There are certain developer responsibilities for security that need to be upheld, and if they're not upheld, you should get fired. Doesn't mean you can't find the next job, but if you do violate those, you deserve to be fired.
So we're all agreeing then that there's some baseline, of course, at which the developer needs to be or to surpass with respect to their security skills. So let's dive into some areas that maybe will help us unpack this a little bit as well. So identity management.
No way. No, I mean, certainly not at scale. I mean, if you're talking about a tiny startup, sure, okay, they're going to have to put something in place. But in any kind of decent-sized enterprise, that's got to be the purview of a governance group, be it a security team or some, maybe even a dedicated IAM team, just a team that focuses purely on identity. Maybe give the microservices-based developers a little bit of infrastructure to say, use this module, do this thing, and you'll get appropriate identity within your system. And if they do it right, they'll use good DevOps principles like infrastructure as code, immutable infrastructure as well for their security policy, so that the security permissions for a microservice and the identity it requires at runtime in staging or prod or whatever go with the microservice from inception all the way through the pipeline until it actually goes live. So there's nice ways to do it that don't impact velocity, but some human somewhere that is not the developer has to say, yes, I'm okaying this microservice to access this critical production database. I'm going to give it this particular permission and privilege. The developer can't be unilaterally making that decision. No.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's falling down there is in not so much you mentioned the startup side, but in the larger enterprise, when we've got 50 to 100 different development teams, there may not be a policy or a framework that says if you're going to write a new microservice, this is how you're going to handle identity management and key auth and things like that. But it also comes down to the social coding concept inside your organization. Like, we need to share modules that we've written and things that we've done across development teams, so we're not reinventing the wheel. And I did a talk with Kelsey Hightower a couple of weeks ago in Toronto, as he described it as, these organizations have all these kind of different butterflies, but they all have one wing. None of them are really described properly and shared across the organization. So not even sharing repos across your org is a problem. And most people say we can't do it because of security. And we need to challenge that. There's things we can do to put security in place, but still share code and share best practice across our organization.
So Shannon, when you think about the developer teams that you work with, I assume that identity is one of the areas that they focus on, or how does that look?
Yeah, I think we're kind of commingling a whole bunch of concepts, and So identity, verifying a person's identity is different than the authorization scheme and access associated with an application and what it's going to connect to, as well as sort of understanding of what they're creating and what access it needs, as well as when authorization is granted to consumers of that application, just how far they actually extended the use case or the abuse cases that have to be prevented in certain circumstances. So I tend to lean a little bit of a different way, which is while they might not deal directly with coding the identity application or even trying to code the authorization application associated with their app, the standpoint of understanding what they're trying to create, how it should be operating, whether or not something is an overextension of their code base and how that service is being used is something straight in their purview. So I'm not certain I would take it away. I think that in a microservice world, what I'd want to do is equip them and then also give them the sense of when they've made mistakes, very quickly making sure that they're aware of those so that they can correct them. Putting the power back into their decision capability.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to kind of find that balance point, isn't it? And so if I think about things like vulnerability management and scanning, there's aspects of that absolutely the developer should be taking on. What do you guys think?
Oh, I totally think the developer needs to be able to make decisions about the vulnerabilities in their application. They should have tools at their disposal to understand when they've pulled a library for the ability to create something. If it's vulnerable, they're the first one to know. And then from there, ultimately being able to make the decisions around how much risk are they going to take and how little risk, depending on what it is they're trying to achieve.
So static code and dynamic code analysis tools, of course, they're going to need to use. Do we go beyond that? And they're doing the scanning. Once it's in production, they're still looking for issues, that kind of thing. Where does it stop for the developer?
There's no reason why they can't do those things. It's just making it easier and making it productive for them. That's basically the rub. Right now, most security tools and commercial capabilities are not ready to be consumed by developers.
One of the things I see, the challenges I see, is just basic updating of applications. So the whole microservice concept excites a lot of people because it's immutable, and we assume that every time someone wants to make a code change, they're going to have to, deploy to some lower environment, and then it's going to make its way through. Unlike the days of we would just go in and SSH to a server and make whatever update we had to do. But I still see the challenge of, let's say, a really strong development team builds a new application for an enterprise customer. They get it out the door, they get it to production, they made sure all their struts libraries were updated, and they did not have any vulnerability. The reality is a month or two or 6 months later, there's going to be vulnerabilities in those software pieces that they've chosen. And if the applications don't have the ability to be updated quickly, and there's so much broken process in the organization, then breaches are going to happen. We're not seeing them at the lower levels. We're seeing them at the application level where people are finding a way around it. And in most cases, we're seeing that we already knew about the vulnerability, or the community already knew about it, and we put a bulletin out. And it's just this inability to upgrade software and get things through the pipeline in a quick fashion that's really causing most of the vulnerabilities, from what I'm seeing anyway. And that's one challenge we need to address. And sure, microservices are going to help in these new approaches, but it's not going to work for all applications.
Okay, so let's go to something maybe a bit more contentious, and that could be around threat intelligence. Amir, maybe I'll go to you to start with this one, then we'll have other folk chime in.
There are two sides of a coin. One is that developers typically focus on a specific set of features and or specific skill set, and that doesn't make him necessarily an expert on every threat that's out there. That said, there is the OWASP model, for example, that gives you a pretty good list of things to watch out for. So if you are an ethical developer and you want to put out the best code, you do go through the list of known threats and make sure that you write code that doesn't incorporate those vulnerabilities advertently in your code, that you take the extra care to make sure that things are done the right way.
I think the thing we would typically ask developers to do is be informed and be very aware of what's happening in their space. But if you apply the sort of the racing model to it, I wouldn't make them the single entity accountable for that entire dimension. Anything that's automatable, anything that's easy to plug into a pipeline, like a vulnerability scan, I mean, there are some things that are just so ridiculously easy now that you're really not doing your job if you're not taking advantage of them. Like GitHub will email you if you're using some library, like a Ruby library, a Ruby gem that's got known CVs, and that you just gotta follow that and use that. That there's no excuse for not doing that. But becoming experts and sort of, red team kind of level skill wise, in your day job, I think it's great if it can happen, but I just think pragmatically it's not going to happen, and provably so. Our industry is showing it's not happening, and I'm looking to other solutions to do it other than just banging your head against the wall and expecting security experts to crop up out of nowhere. It's not happening. We're not educating them. They're not getting enough tools to do it, so let's give them the tools to get it off their plate and have them inform them threats and new developments in the world of hackery. But I just don't see the current situation as tenable.
And so, Amir, you must be thinking that speaks to what we do. So how does that play into what the philosophy is from an Apparato standpoint?
Thanks for that, David. Basically, the way we look at things is that the application itself also has an identity. So, and I want to distinguish application identity from the end user identity. The application identity is derived from the various tags that the DevOps teams puts into the code throughout the production lifecycle, but it also includes intelligence feeds from, let's say, scanners or from dynamic scanners in runtime. And as new vulnerabilities come up, the identity of the workloads change. And our belief is that while developers can take the most care up front, as Kyle said, there will be unforeseen things that will pop up in the future, new exploits that will come up. And those new exploits can be seen as an application identity change. And you can write policies proactively to prevent bad application behavior, or at least quarantine them and shut them down. So for example, if all of a sudden you get a new CVE and a new scan, so the definitions have been updated, and you get a new CVE that's rated as high for an application that's communicating with sensitive data, at that point you can say, preclude my application from touching the sensitive data because the identity changed in a way that I'm uncomfortable with. And that's the way we are gearing our security tools for the DevOps market.
Makes a lot of sense. And so if we start to stretch this out a little bit and we think, should a developer become a pen tester? Like, should they be going that far, Shannon, from your standpoint, if we're just to kind of go to, what's the depth of the skills of the developer?
Oh man, you gave me a hard position. So DevOps, we've basically now migrated a lot of different things into the developer. And again, I think it has to do with the scope and the size of your application as to whether you should take on some of these activities. I think pen testing, to the point of red teaming, pen testing has become somewhat less useful over the years, especially as you're moving into the cloud, migrating your applications, because pen testing doesn't really go as far as to review the code in most occasions. I said most occasions, so every pen tester out there shouldn't be disgruntled at the moment. But I do think that a developer that's trying to ensure that their code is as resilient as possible, their application is not being able to be taken over by a bad guy, that some of the things that they're doing are not being able to be abused. Again, I go back to the person who's making the changes, who has the ability to affect the code, to remediate mistakes, is really solely the folks that are building that application, that maintain that application. And in the DevOps space, really that goes back to the people who are the creators, the makers of it. And so I do believe that there is some onus on testing, security testing, that does need to fall to the team that's actually creating the application and maintaining it. Now, how they get backup and how they might be supported in an ecosystem is really up to the service providers of that ecosystem. But the main value of their application requires it to be highly available, secure and resilient against bad guys, that it's performant, all of those things that a customer and consumer of that application is going to want.
Can I jump in with something? So I agree with you, Shannon, completely. But it's just difficult from an economic perspective to see it happening. Like the idea of developers loving their microservices and sort of owning them in their heart and keeping them improved and up to date. I think that's great. I also think it's just not common because the pressures that led to microservices being adopted in the first place are such that security is getting left to the wayside in favor of more microservices, more features, more applications, more releases, etc. And what happens is that HA, as an example, is a feature that gets prioritized because the system will not operate, the SLAs will not be met, response time will not work. So it's pretty easy to justify economically to the PMs and so forth. This system's got to be HA, it's got to have, all this uptime guarantees, etc. But then security, it's like, hey, what are we mitigating here? Maybe we won't get hacked. And it just seems to get sidelined very quickly because risk mitigation is just hard to justify economically.
But that's because people aren't actually measuring the right things. Like, I agree with what you're saying, but I think it's because what I'm seeing is the counter. You can measure HA. What we're not seeing in the industry right now is proper measurement for security. As an example, when we ask our developers to add telemetry and logging to their applications, they do see things and they say things because of it. But because we haven't really focused at that level, we're not necessarily putting measures on their plate that are making it so that they understand what good looks like. As an example, if your application has high adversary interest and high adversary return rate, there's something that you're doing in creating that application that's causing it to be abused at a high enough level that there's things that you can do to make it better. Also, dealing with things like passive intel, there's a lot more lucky than there is good, and simply understanding some of these mechanisms at the developer level can help to make them more resilient. What I'm saying is that the ecosystem itself cannot believe that the role of security is something that's separate from the maker and creator position.
Well, if it comes down to a sprint or a list of backlogs, how do we prioritize some of these things that are more security focused rather than it being a feature or a new ad in the application? The product managers making those decisions and having the weight to be able to make them is very important. I mean, how much unit testing do we even see today after it's become such a common practice for people to do? Now we're asking people to write security unit tests. So without any kind of stick to mandate that people do this or development teams do it, and I don't think it's that they don't want to, it comes down to prioritization, like you said, is we can only do so much with a certain amount of time. So how do we prioritize some of these things before we end up in the paper, rather than it becoming drop everything and address all these security issues because now, we've got mud in our face because we didn't do updates and we didn't do the things we should have did.
That's why I believe that you have to have prioritization from a security perspective driven by the development team. They have the notion of P0, P1, P2. And when we find defects that a developer needs to remediate, if as security professionals that are assisting with this development capability, we're putting those items into the backlog at the right priority level with the understanding of, is there adversary interest? How much return rate is there happening in the scheme of that application? And we're helping developers to understand, is it maintenance mode, stuff that I have to worry about? Or is this like everything, my application is infested and I've got to do something about it? I still go back to the developer makes those decisions, and we need to be able to speak the right language.
How do we balance that, though? Because how do we interest them? Is it an incentive we need to give them, or does it have to be a stick? Because there's going to be lots of things in the backlog, and how do we encourage people to put more time into the things that aren't important until there's a problem? That would be somebody's argument, right?
They are important. And actually, if you write the defect the right way, you give them a sense of what is happening with their application, and they're in on it with you. Every developer that I've talked to wants to make sure that their application, their service is available, resilient. They take those things to heart. I think that when it comes to enabling people, having them be not just aware, but understand what they're dealing with is really the critical change that has to happen in the industry. And so I guess what I'm kind of like summing up is the person who's making the code changes is in full power and needs as much ability to understand and make decisions as possible. And by the way, if you make it part of the backlog, that is the developer's work. And yes, they might prioritize it to be less important over time. What I'll tell you is I've seen P0 changes that have happened within minutes because the security defect was written in a way that made the developer understand the importance of it.
So a key point there I'd agree with is it coming from a defect, right? So now they're aware of it. I think there's a certain amount of proactivity too, but it's important for QA teams or whoever to be able to identify the defects, and then it's in your face for sure. So I agree. Go ahead, Amir. Sorry about that.
So yeah, if I were to paraphrase what Shannon says, and Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what she's saying is there are basics of best practices, and every developer that wants to stay in the forefront of his or her own profession, they pick up these best practices. Part of those best practices are building the code in a way that's easily traceable, easily loggable, and easily resolvable in case of a security leak. Those practices evolve over time, but it's to the developer's best interest to stay ahead of the skills curve and build the code the right way in a microservices world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to expect that they want to, and that our job as security professionals is to assist in not just letting them be aware, but helping them to understand what bad guys do and providing mechanisms. And that's why I think we've invested in Red Team ourselves. Is it's not good enough to just go scan something or to let somebody believe that they're pushing code without it being fully resilient and tested.
So, Brian, when I think about the changing role of the developer, and I think about all the things that either we're going to be asking them to do or carrots and sticks we're going to be using. When you think about the role of the manager, which to some degree has started to diminish as we look at the different kinds of teams, whether it's from a Scrum perspective or, Kanban or you name it, does the role of the manager increase in importance to start to make some of this happen? Or how does that look from your standpoint?
Speaking as a dev manager, one of the more increasingly important parts of our job is making PMs and the business aware of the importance of security fixes. So this is where, as Shannon knows, we're talking about P0s, getting those debates understood, because, we're technical managers usually, and making maybe less technical people in the business aware of the risk so that it can be justified. Because a lot of people think hacking is, I'm going to steal some passwords, or get into the systems and steal some email addresses. It's so much more than that now. It's defacement, reputation, it's crypto mining. There's so many different things that are happening in breaches. We have an opportunity to really up our game in terms of justifying it economically. And moving security left, bringing more automation in, that's, again, if it's crossing and spanning teams, it's probably going to be more successful than just, grassroots developers trying to do it one by one. And each, what was the comment earlier about butterflies with one wing? Better to have it more as a coherent effort. And not to say that it's a top-down, enterprisey, old school, here's the way we're going to do things, guys. It's about just making sure everybody's aware that security is a priority, why it's a priority, and enabling success in that. That's a new role for an engineering manager, because it has not traditionally been.
Be it resolved that developer employability hinge on their security skills. Incredible points made on all sides of this debate today. So let's go into the final actions that we've got for our developers to take away this week. Shannon, what do you have for developers? What do you think they should be doing this week?
I think developers need to start looking for opportunities to take advantage of security tech that's out there, increase telemetry, start measuring adversary interest and return rate. That's going to require you to understand how to borrow, beg, and steal from your threat intel folks. But there's absolutely a need to measure your abuse case and understand the ideal victims for your applications.
Kyle, what are you thinking? What actions should they take away this week?
Yeah, I think it's just about constantly improving yourself and learning as much as you can. Let's be honest. My point was I don't think that the market is really going to struggle in a way the developer can't find work, but getting that security skill and brushing up on it, you can certainly sell yourself in that manner. And it's going to be a very popular skill set, and you're going to separate yourself from the rest of the development crop, and you're going to get that job that you want to, or build that next great startup. So I think just keep always learning, experiment, and pass the knowledge on to the community is another important part. So we've got a great open source community out here. Let's share the wealth.
And Amir, from your perspective,
I want to reiterate what Shannon and Kyle both said. Basically, stay in the forefront with the skills, and part of those is learning more about service mesh and what application identity means. There's a lot of really interesting developments coming down with things like Istio. It would be great for microservices developers to learn what Istio is doing and how the idea of a service mesh and application identity works within the constructs of security. This would be a great action item for developers to go investigate in this area.
And Brian Kelly, what actions should they take away?
Two things. I would like every developer listening to go to their architects or managers and say, how can I put guardrails around me so that I'm working in a high velocity mode that does not increase risk and just puts me in a safer place? And what kind of technology or automation do we need for that to happen? And secondly, if you're a developer and you release some software that has a default account set up called username admin and password admin, and you put that into the market, then please pick a different profession.
So Shannon Leitz, how can individuals reach you at any conferences that you're going to be speaking at, any articles you're going to be publishing coming up soon?
I'm going to be at LastCon in the fall again. I'm super excited. I'm working on a few articles and some books. We're in the middle of revamping devsecops.org. And you can catch up with me at DevSecOps.
Amir Sharif, same questions. How can people reach you, and where can they find you speaking or writing?
I do write a few blogs on the Apparata website. So apparata.com is a good place to see some of my thoughts. Also, I'll be at Google Cloud Next and at VMworld later this summer. VMworld, the reason I find that show quite interesting is that it's a nice transition from the legacy world towards what's becoming a cloud-native world. So you'll find people who are both interested in solar energy as well as those who want to make coal great again.
Kyle Bazette, how can people reach you?
Yeah, dude, I try to blog quite a bit at arctic.ca. We try to push the community along and do a lot of community meetups in Toronto and try to bring people together to share knowledge. And I'll also be skipping across the country to go check out Google next week. So if you're in San Francisco, send me a tweet at Kyle Bassett, and love to get together and meet some new people.
Perfect. And Brian Kelly, CyberArk, how can people reach you?
Yeah, so, I'm about to run over across the street to the CyberArk conference in Boston today. But I usually blog at conjure.org. Conjure is our open source machine identity security policy as code vault solution. I'm on Twitter at BRIKELLY as well.
And there you have it. Threat Actions this week. Recorded July the 17th, 2018. I'm David Senf. See you again next week.
We made lots of good points on we need automation, but we also need to, put more awareness and power, as Shannon said, in the developer, and trust that they will think about the right things and they will want to work on those.
I think one of the things that I really heard resounding is that the developer is becoming overloaded, and I think that's an area that we really need to focus on.